Hello, I'm back and finished this morning a reread of the Greek tragedy Hecuba, or Hecabe, by the tragedian Euripides. And I'd like to share some thoughts on that. Euripides is one of the four Greek playwrights we have extant plays from. One of the three tragedians. We actually have more plays from Euripides than both Aeschylus and Sophocles combined. He was I believe the youngest of those three, Aeschylus being the oldest. But Sophocles lived for an extremely long time and actually outlived Euripides. Euripides was not quite as celebrated, certainly as Sophocles, who's by far the most celebrated of the Athenian tragedians, the Athenian playwrights. Euripides didn't win nearly as many prizes as Sophocles. He would be invited to participate in the sort of theater festivals, but then would not receive a prize. He is throughout the 20th century, really, he's been, I would say, probably the most popular of those three playwrights. And I haven't always felt that way. I think there are many times in life where I've preferred Aeschylus to both Sophocles and Euripides. But there are times in life where Euripides sort of returns. I would say Sophocles is my least favorite of the three, beyond Oedipus Tyrannus, which I regard as one of the finest plays of all time, and certainly the strongest of the Greek tragedies. I would say overall Sophocles is probably my least favorite of the three, and Euripides and Aeschylus sort of just, are weighed in the balance in my mind, much as in Aristophanes' Comedy of the Frogs. Those two are weighed in the balance, and many times in life it's been Aeschylus that I prefer, but there are times where Euripides really just, his ideas and his characters in a large sense speak to me. There are two things about Euripides that I think it's important to note when reading any of his tragedies. The first is that he, in a sense, sort of presages mysteries, the modern sort of mystery novel, where a good mystery has sort of a twist that surprises you and elicits some joy and delight, and a great mystery is rereadable even after you know that twist. You know what the ending is, but it's such a great story. The characters are so well developed. The dialogue or the characterization is so strong that you appreciate the story and you want to return to it despite knowing how it ends. And Euripides, in a sense, gives away the ending to every single one of his plays. In the first, when the first character or the first chorus comes on and jumps into some poetry, that character essentially lays out the plot of the entire play. If you read the first 2 pages of any play of Euripides, you're pretty much given exactly what's going to happen for the rest of the play. And the modern interpretation of that is that Euripides does that because he wanted people to focus on the language. He wanted people to focus on the poetry. He wanted people to focus on what is said, not what is happening. I think personally, I agree with most of that, but I think part of what he was doing was signaling to his audiences that he wasn't going to try and pull a bunch of surprises on them. And I'm sure at some point in the future I'll do a video on Oedipus the King by Sophocles, but our interpretation of some of the Greek myths is actually an interpretation introduced by the 5th century Athenian dramatists. In some of the early myths, awful things would happen to heroes or to different characters, and they would, I don't want to say they would shrug them off, but they wouldn't deal with them in the sort of fatalistic, almost nihilistic way that some of the characters of the Greek tragedies deal with them. That, Oedipus in the myths of the Bronze Age, in Homer's sort of the epic tradition of Homer, Oedipus finds out everything that he's done, but he doesn't blind himself and then go into exile and sort of throw himself forward into this tragic fate. He is merely an agent that the gods have wreaked havoc on humans through, and it's not so much his fault. The dramatists actually changed those myths. They changed the endings. And I think on some level it was to surprise audiences. It was to you want to win a prize, well, do something different. Take that myth everybody's aware of and give it a new ending. And maybe they'll really think you're amazing. And I think Euripides gives away the ending in the beginning of all of his plays because he wants the audience to know I'm not just going to spring something on you. I'm not going to take that myth that you've heard recited, in the epic tradition and switch it up at the last second on you to give you a surprise. I want you to really focus on what I'm saying. The other thing that Euripides does that's in my mind very fascinating is he tries to take the concept of heroes, the concept of these demigods or even the gods, and put them at a level that is much more human, to give them the psychological motivations, the desires that we really recognize in other humans, and to make the heroes seem like people they could have interacted with in other, the audience could interact with in their own daily lives and in their own personal settings. And I think that's the major piece of Euripides that is valuable, and it's the piece that I think is responsible for his popularity, especially in the 20th century and in our modern times. Euripides is often regarded as sort of the most readable of the Greek tragedians, and I really believe part of that is because his characters seem more human and less archetypal than in Aeschylus or even in Sophocles. And as a piece of that, within Hecuba, there's a bit where Euripides has one of the characters share a line that, in my mind, is an inversion of Homer's Iliad, where Homer has exactly one commoner in the Iliad speak. The commoner goes up, calls out all of the Greek generals as a bunch of hypocritical, cowardly, whiny losers. He's absolutely accurate. And then Odysseus gets up and basically, backhands this character Thersites and sort of mocks him to the entire, Athenian army or Greek army and war council. And in that scene is in the Iliad in part to show us that, listen, like, epic and heroic tales are not the province of common people. And Euripides has one of his characters actually say something very similar to that, where at one point Hecuba, who's the former queen of Troy, the mother of Paris and Hector and, all of those of Priam's and Hecuba's children, Cassandra, who ultimately meet their death during or immediately after the Trojan War. Hecuba was the queen at that time and the mother. And so she at one point says to Odysseus, speak to them, your reputation will sway them, even with doubtful arguments. A word has double power, coming from one whom men respect. And it really, in different translations, that line is sometimes made, a little bit more is made of that line. And I really believe it's in part because Euripides is essentially kind of going against Homer here. He's saying, look, two people can say the exact same thing, and if one of them is a commoner and the other is someone who is a hero or is a demigod or is well known or a king, the one who has power, when the words of that person, even though they're the same, the words of that person in the audience and in the minds of other characters is going to be given much more weight. It has much more value. It has much more power. And Euripides is identifying the hypocrisy of that. And so that's a main theme, a key theme throughout his plays that I think is important to note anytime you're approaching any of them. Within Hecuba, the story is fairly simplistic. Troy has fallen. The Greek navy has left Turkey and moved west to a province north of Greece, Thrace. And all the ships are then stuck there. There's no wind for the sails. The ships are stuck. And they are told that the deceased Achilles wants a blood sacrifice and once that happens, the gods will then allow the sails to move forward. And that's a parallel, Euripides knows it, that's a parallel to what happens at the beginning of the Trojan War, when Agamemnon is told that the gods need a blood sacrifice in order to give wind to the ships to sail to Troy. Now the ghost of Achilles, and through dreams and such, have told the Greeks, well, you're going to need another blood sacrifice in order to get the ships all the way home, to move south and sail home. And they've decided, it's such a great group of people they are. And Euripides is very sort of, ha ha sheesh. There's an undercurrent of irony and distaste for the Greek histories here, where Euripides makes it very clear that the Agamemnon and the bloodthirsty sort of the sense of guilt and shame that just pushes through this entire narrative is absolutely reprehensible. Euripides is writing as the Peloponnesian War is going on, and it's an enormous civil war between the Greek city-states, and it's moving towards becoming a war of annihilation, where really only one city-state can be left in this sort of duel. And Euripides regards all of this with extreme distaste, and he makes that very clear. So the Greeks have been told they need to sacrifice the youngest daughter of Hecuba and Priam, and Odysseus shows up. And Odysseus, we always think of Odysseus as this clever character that's like just heroic. He's like a really smart Philip Marlowe, if you've read the Raymond Chandler novels. He's just perseveres. He makes it to the end. This is the guy who doesn't quit. He doesn't give up. He's clever. And Euripides in his plays regards Odysseus as something akin to, I don't know, a congressman or a lawyer or an insurance agent. I mean, the worst caricatures of all of those, professions. Odysseus is regarded as a liar. He's regarded as just kind of a coward, someone who will plead and whine, but then scorn those who need his help. He's awful. And so Odysseus shows up, and he's outed as the cowardly whiner that he is. He's not going to help anyone, and Hecuba wants to find some way to save this daughter, and ultimately there's no way to do it. And thus, that seems to be the main part of the Greek tragedy. But remember, Euripides gives away the ending, and the first character who's speaking it's kind of similar to Shakespeare's Hamlet. The first character who's speaking is the ghost of Hecuba and Priam's youngest son, Polydor. Not Polydor Virgil, just son named Polydor, who had been sent with some Trojan treasure to Thrace to basically wait out the Trojan War. In case the worst happened, he would be there. Well, once the war had ended, and there's no one to hold, the king of Thrace accountable, he murders this boy, he steals all the treasure. Well, there's just this dual smash of Hecuba's, her daughter has been murdered, and now she finds out her son's been murdered, and the body found, sort of washed ashore. And we were told this was going to happen, and now it does. And so she decides it's time for vengeance. And there's this very strange dialogue between she and Agamemnon, who Agamemnon's responsible for, the entire war that caused her ruin. He's responsible for all of these awful things that are occurring. It was his willingness to sacrifice a daughter at the beginning of the Trojan War that is being paralleled by the sacrifice of Hecuba's daughter here at the end of, after this Trojan War. He's currently enslaved her daughter Cassandra and is using her as a concubine. And that's putting it as lightly as possible, depending on, my personal audience here on BookTube. But Agamemnon is not a good person. He's not a good man, and yet he is probably the most honorable, living man within this entire play. And I think Euripides is telling us something there, something about, the people in power maybe shouldn't be trusted, that the people we thought were good are not good. The people we thought were bad are bad, but at least we know they're bad. And so Agamemnon, again, is not going to help Hecuba, but he also makes it clear he's not going to do anything to prevent her from seeking vengeance for her son. Because this is one of the pieces of tradition that Euripides holds on to, and we see it a few times, but that is very important throughout Greek tragedy. And those of you who are fans of the Game of Thrones series or the Song of Ice and Fire novels are familiar with the concept of guest right. That if you share hospitality with someone, you are in a sense like welcoming them into your family on some level. Like you will not harm them, certainly while they're your guest or while you're their guest. You don't harm them. That's really why the Trojan War is so not the Trojan War. The abduction of Helen by Paris is so awful is not because of the adultery involved or stealing another person's wife. It's because he did it while he was a guest at their house. That's the really awful part. And the crime that the king of Thrace has committed against Hecuba's son Polydor and against Hecuba is really awful, not because he murdered a boy and stole the boy's, the family's gold. It's because he was supposed to be protecting that boy. That boy was his guest. And when Hecuba seeks revenge and Agamemnon is sort of asked to, make a judge, again, this man has no moral standing, yet he's going to judge who's right and wrong in this setting. And Euripides knows that his audience knows this. And he wants them to be thinking about that. Agamemnon is asked to weigh it, and Hecuba's entire argument is based on that idea of guest right, of look, if there's one thing that we have to hold true to, it's that. And there's an important line in there where there's a discussion around, listen, guest right is a custom, and customs are important. And it's only by those customs that we're worshiping these gods and seeking their blessings. And we just did a blood sacrifice, earlier today. By custom, demanded to gods that we worship by custom. If you're not going to let me seek revenge on what by custom we regard as the most heinous of crimes, then what's the deal? And so that ultimately becomes sort of the ending, is Agamemnon having to weigh the importance of custom and guest right in Hecuba's desire to seek revenge. And although Euripides always gives away the ending, I will choose not to, and encourage you to read this play. It's very short. Depending on the translations you find, it's between 30 to maybe 80 pages and can be read in one day. You can find different translations. I have two different ones. The one I read was from an old volume that has prose translations of Greek tragedies, in part because I find the notes valuable on it. But it's available within the Penguin Classics edition of Euripides that has Medea there on the front. And there are other sort of, free online translations, but that was Hecuba by Euripides, a great way to sort of start the year with some Greek tragedy and hopefully be continuing to dip into those as I have for the past 12 years now. Hope everyone else is having a great end to the weekend and start to the week. Thank you.